Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, the podcast for writers who strive to be bold and readers who crave something new. I'm your host, Jonathan Ball. I want to thank you for being here, and I want us to stay in touch. So subscribe to this podcast, then go to writingthewrongway.com and enter your best email to receive the Martian Embassy Missive, my bi-weekly newsletter where I let you know what's happening on Mars, where we're always making big plans. Join the Martians so you don't get left out of the invasion at writingthewrongway.com. And as a special bonus, I'll send you a free book. Speaking of books, my new book is The Lightning of Possible Storms, a collection of short fiction that reads like a novel. It includes stories about a mad scientist trying to steal his son's dreams, a story where a personification of capitalism is trying to impress his boss by winning a contest at work, a story about a Hollywood producer who just decides to adapt a bunch of explosions, and many other stories, some funny, some terrifying. Salima Nawaz says that is cheerfully horrifying and full of the unexpected. Suzette Mayer says it's beautifully written and expertly composed. And I say, it's time you read this book. I've been working on it for almost 20 years, and I'm excited to share it with you. So please go to possiblestorms.com. Again, that's possiblestorms.com, and you'll find out a lot more about this book and some of the bonuses that you can get when you buy this book. Let's get on with the show. I'm talking to Dennis Cooley, one of my great writing teachers, and a very respected and influential poet, especially here in Winnipeg. And Dennis has got 3 new books out. He's always, just putting out some amazing stuff. And I'd like to ask you, just to start with, Dennis, to read from at least 2 of those books. One from, you've got 2 books out of Turnstone Press, so it'd be great for you to read from one of those books. And then also you've got a 3rd book from At Bay Press. So if you could just read a little bit from when the Bestiary and the Muse Sings, I'd really appreciate it. Because I really like hearing you read. You're one of the only people I like to hear read.
Oh, well, you say things like that, and I may just read nonstop. Okay, anyway, here we go. This is from the Bestiary. It's a collection of creatures, many of them domestic, many farm animals. But here are pigs. Meanwhile, pigs talk. They don't keep them much to themselves. There'd be whiskered ruminations on dung and flies. Cherish the close and convivial inquiries. Join in their song of chop and dandelions. Daily probe the state of turnips. Consider with gravitas the bulge of cabbage. Old geezers on the porch sizing up the neighbors. Though genial in patience, the pigs rave and swear. Rains will wash over, just you wait and see. The sun will surely hit in a splot sweeter than a slop pail full of rotten potatoes. Also, and not to be poo-pooed, the flies will arrive in a strange sizzle, a hard lacquer in their gaze. The pigs will grow miscreant, tail twistingly giddy with all the guzzling and slurping, crazed with the delicacies, sucking them down, blue flies shiny as candies. Those are the pigs. I don't know if you were in the visual. We had the wonderful illustration with it.
Oh, wow, that's beautiful.
Okay, and this from the Muse Sings. This is called Dear Dubé, for Paulette Dubé. Though I grow doubtful whether Our Lady of Perpetual Help Pool Hall still saves from miscues or rescues anyone, I want to be there. I want to be without hesitation, lifted from inertia. A pool ball white as a leper, interloper in collusion among. The red and rolling hearts want to carome among the blue and brown and green. See the black and pink and yellow ones perpetually rolling and shining. There where they brush against the cushions, nudge other hearts that click happily in collision. I want to be a part of the 1,000 shocks flesh is heir to, that pool of help and forgiveness. Exactly when their lines true, they clear the table with all the joy and clatter they can muster. Les habitués de billard, as once they wrapped the dead Mary, Queen of Scots, in felt from her billiard table, a final game of billet-doux. And you, cool pool hall poet, when they chalk one up, you ain't even flustered, are you? Indubiter you, oh doobie doobie doo.
Oh, that's great. Now, Dennis, before we kind of dive into the books more specifically, I want to talk a bit about your kind of overall like broad process, because when I think back all the time to the creative writing class that I took with you back in the day, where I met Gregory Kremichik and Slima Nawaz and John Toon, it was just a really a class we all still talk about as, one being just chock full of people who ended up publishing. Almost everybody from that class ended up publishing a book. It was really unreal.
Yeah,
In fact, one time me and Gregory were walking around through McNally Robinson after going to somebody's book launch, and we ran into I forget her name of some, but there was like an older woman who was taking the class. She published a book coming out of the class about her her life story. And like every single person in that class, we were actually even just talking about that. And then we like walked past another person who, published a book at that class, But one thing I really sticks with me from that class and from like your teaching about creative writing is this idea you had of mining the site. I remember the way you explained it was, you kind of find a site, something that you think is interesting and you want to dig deep down into. And then you just sort of, as a writer, you think of all the different ways you could mine that site. You could just attack the subject from any number of angles and write, a ton of different takes or tests. And it just sort of, I've been very much found this to be a powerful lesson, this approach of just sort of thinking through all the different ways one could kind of mine this material once you kind of found a vein and looking for where's the site, where I could maybe get some interesting stuff out of the ground. I just wonder if you could talk a bit about that idea of mining the site and kind of, you can certainly do it more articulately than I could, but I'm curious about that concept a bit, and also just how you practically do that. So when you actually go to sit down and write The Muse Sings, say, or Bestiary or Cold Press Moon, when you actually, one, how do you settle on a sort of site to mine? And then two, like how do you go through mining that site?
You described the process, I think, about as well as anyone could. But yeah, that's what I've done from a way back. I suspect to some degree, many writers do that to some degree. That your mind takes you somewhere for whatever reasons, and once it's there, the neurons start breaking loose and colliding and open up real possibilities. I don't know if you find this or other writers find this, but I think once your brain gets operating off a text, it starts generating almost neurotically. Neurotically, I suppose would be a better way of putting it. It starts sparking things, go fire there. But it's more deliberate for me too, as you were describing it. I find something that usually something I'm intensely interested in or enjoy enormously. Sometimes I find them by accident. I got onto the Dracula poems, which I did as a collection. I got into them when I was first working in fairy tale poems quite a long time ago. And I said, okay, I've got these well-known ones I'm working on. What else is out there? So I think, well, there's Dracula and there was Frankenstein. In fact, they show up in this latest book in some ways, the book Cold Press Moon. So that kind of thinking about playing with a site, but it also takes me to research and say, well, what else is out there? I read things and I use the internet a lot. Say, well, who's this Theseus guy again? And you start spinning off and takes you somewhere and somebody's got you over in working in mazes, and you think of a pun with maize as in corn, and you're into wheat fields, and you can move around off those kind of connections that the website really enables. But all of the sites are ones that I really like, that I find stimulating and fascinating and enjoyable. I really appreciate your comment about the pleasure, the joy in these things. I have a kind of infantile pleasure in play and bad puns, as I'm sure you know. But it's not any kind of systematic or methodical thing. It's more a kind of focus, and I don't simply stay in one of those sites. I've got many projects going at the same time, so that there are these 3 books, and it may look to someone as if I got really busy for the last year, but these things have all come out of years of earlier work too. I've got the biggest project I've been working on. I began in 1989. I'm still working on it, and it's got huge and had various spin-offs already. So it's a kind of sustained focus for me, and I at the moment have a couple other projects in the go as I was kind of finishing up these ones. I don't know if that's any help to you, but how do you do it anyway? I get in it, and I make notes like everyone else. I make notes and I draft things, and I write down phrases I think might be handy somewhere, and I gather them up, and I go back in drafts. I've got all kinds of notes and drafts that I re-enter and pillage for other purposes.
The impression I got taking that class, the thing that really impressed me about the idea is that I have maybe a more methodical approach than you do, but I will sit. I really like since taking that class, I generated a lot of projects and whole books by just sort of sitting and thinking about that sort of. How would I mine it? Like when I wrote Clockfire, for example, I was thinking about the theater, and I was thinking, okay, if I'm in the theater, like I'll sit down there and I'll think like through it in a kind of systematic way. It's like, okay, well, what's in the theater? There's a curtain in the theater. There's chairs in the theater. Yeah. There's a stage. There's, like I'll just go through, there's like sandbags. Like I would just run through them all and like just think, but I think the difference that it made to me is what I kind of learned from you in many respects with that, like alongside like, you just kind of think through that what's here in this fertile ground, but you'll actually do drafts. Like you actually write a poem. I'll write a poem. Like I'll write like 200, 300 poems to get down to like maybe 80 poems I like in that area. But I test things out. Like I find that a lot of writers, aside from you, one thing I think that separates you from a lot of writers is that you will actually sit there and write 500 poems on the topic, as opposed to sitting there and trying to think what are the 80 thing. Like you'll kind of like actually do the work to mine the site. And I see a lot of people, and my tendency even that I have to fight against with kind of adopting your process in some way is I have this tendency where I'll sit there and I'll think of 10 poems and I'll think, okay, well, which of these poems should I write? What I think I learned from you is you should write 10 poems. Yeah. You should write all 20, write 2 versions of each poem. Like just the writing is the sort of, like you don't want to get away from the writing and too far into the research or too far into being analytical about it, but really, have those things on the side and informing what the writing is doing.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you do this as well. And I suppose most other writers do versions of this as well. I move a lot of things internally. I've got some notes over here and I've got poems coming along here. And I think, well, I could just pull this out of here and work it in here somewhere. It may just give me a nice little turn and or pick up that second line in a nice way. So I'm constantly moving. I move even from project to project, saying, I could maybe put this over in that Love in the Dryland project, my work over there. So I'm pretty willing to transpose words, phrases, whole poems, sections into different sites.
That's another thing I credit you with is when I do that. I did it recently. I was stuck with this comic project I was doing with the grade grade, trying to think, what am I going to do in these? I knew I had like 4 pages I had to fill up. And then I went to like, I had this novel draft, and I was like, I'll just pull a fragment from that novel draft. And now all of a sudden the mother is like telling the story from this other thing to her kid at bedtime, and it works, that kind of, because I've got all this stuff, like you said, like all this stuff, I've actually put it on paper somewhere, even if it's not done, and I can start to pick it up and move it around. Like, I remember thinking like that was something that was really powerful to learn from you, was like that if you can find the right set of things that are going to spark your imagination, if you can kind of almost like set up a series of conditions for your imagination to spark. And like, these things are always like, I'm fascinated with crows. So anytime I'm stuck, I'll just start thinking about crows. How can I get crows in here somehow?
Let me tell you.
There's a playfulness to it.
Yeah. Let me tell you of the bestiary and crows. God knows when this manuscript started, but it began with, 40 or 50 crow poems and 40 or 50 bee poems. The bee poems ended up being almost totally gone, and I cut back the crows because I thought, well, I got to do some more things and get a more variety here. But I was originally going to call this The Birds and the Bees, and mostly crow and bee poems. And it's since then migrated. Okay, what are the other possibilities? You've got creatures, and then I think, well, there's this thing called the bestiary, collection of beast and creature animals. You spread out and see where you may go with that. I moved out there and picked up some farm animals and some domestic animals, and they became part of the bestiary.
And then, of course, you can look at beasts and fable. You can look at beasts and how science treats beasts. You can look at that whole distinction with how we don't think of humans as animals. My kid was trying to correct me the other day because I said humans are animals, and she's like, humans are animals, because she's like 5 years old, right? But that's how you think, that's how you're trained to think. And so all of a sudden now you're into that great thematic space of having attention. I always feel like there's a poem there when there's a tension, between, with the thing, two sort of ideas are kind of coming into conflict.
Yeah.
As opposed to maybe the literal conflict of the story.
The creatures, as I prefer to call them, especially in this collection, which I think is in some ways may sound a little sentimental, but I think not, and it has a further advantage of it names us within this very nicely. But the creatures have very human-like qualities in many ways too, and I do that a lot. These ant creatures are often fairly similar humans in their affections or their anxieties or whatever. The pig shows up, a creature that I really like, a really smart creature in many ways. Affectionate. He talks with the farm kid. This actually came from my own experience, that you can talk with animals in some kind of way.
Yeah, sure. That whole that way the thing is responding to you, and I find it so interesting. The danger I find of this process, I will say it though, is, and I'm curious to know how you approach this, is what I've found is once I'm in a fertile kind of site in this manner, and I can drum up, like all of a sudden the problem isn't coming up with new things and drafts and ideas. I can drum up 500 pages of something relatively simply. It's a matter of where do I stop? What do I put the bounds or the limits on it? Like, how do you actually determine that you're done a project when they have these protein changeability?
I've taken for years to quoting the Mallarmé, who said, "A poem is never done; it's only abandoned." And I remember when I first heard it when I was an undergraduate, I was angry and thinking this is an excuse for being lazy or whatever. But for many years now, I'm thinking, this is actually, for me at least, and I suspect for almost everybody else, is the case. You give up what ends something: exhaustion, sense you got to move on, boredom, the demands of your publisher, day-to-day responsibilities. I had a debate with with someone in the last few years who knows a whole lot about poetry, but she was really offended when I said, no, they're not perfect, and I don't want them to be perfect, and I don't think you can make them perfect. That perfection is a desire for that may be understandable, but I think it's mistaken because it's not possible and it's not desirable. I think it's a similar kind of argument. You abandon, it's not done. It's not finished. It's done. You're for the time being. But also, I go back and revise poems all the time, including poems that are published. So in the sense that that's it. There's nothing more for me to do with it, or it's over. But saying, okay, that version is now over. It's into print.
Why do you say it's not desirable to try to get that perfection?
Well, what would perfection be? I put a little pressure on the notion. I think that it probably leads you inevitably to thinking of fixity and a kind of condition such that no changes could make it any better, or at least different. So see that's it. Nothing. There could be nothing better. I mean, that story everybody tells about in various religions, how it's blasphemous to think you have made a perfect carpet. Only God could be perfect. So you even build in the flaw in it. But I'm kind of arguing probably you will be doing that anyway. That by some standards, this line should have been shorter. I mean, those are all debatable. What is satisfactory? What is good? What is bad? Highly debatable.
Well, it changes all the time, right? Somebody was asking me the other day about how much description should be in a thing, and I was saying, well, if you're writing an 18th century novel, then it's one answer, and if you're writing like a modern thriller, it's another answer. Like it's so specific to the time or to your like mood in a manner that you're trying to create or what have you. I know I have a tendency towards trying to get a perfectionism, but what I find is when I achieve it, when I do get to the point where I feel it's kind of close to perfect, near perfect, it's usually has died at that point. Like because I've taken all the raw edges off of it, and it just starts. There's that ineffable way it kind of starts to lose life, like as it gets too polished.
The stock movie. But I'd make a distinction between notions of perfection and notions of high accomplishment. I work. It may not be apparent, but I work very hard on the poems I write. I revise and rethink them, and move them, dump them. So it's not a case of saying, well, I kind of have a good go for a week or two and say, here are 3 poems. I work on them again and again and again, but they're not perfect. Because they can't be.
You're also one of the people who first brought to my mind the different ways one could break a line, and you wrote a very famous, well-known essay on this called "Breaking and Entering," which I would encourage people to find. But I was wondering if you could just maybe talk a little bit about your philosophy in a nutshell about how to break you break lines or approach line breaking, or even just using the page to lay out a poem, because you do a lot of interesting things on the page itself.
Yeah.
So how do you think through like how to arrange the poem on the page?
Yeah. Okay, I could say quite a few things. Let me just say something about the visual page. That I find it visually far more interesting to have ink distributed on the page, not exactly unevenly, but certainly not systematically off a line or even series of indentations. But when the ink is distributed irregularly, I think that makes a more elegant surface visually. And you've got a lot more configurations, and of course you can handle those to create all kinds of effects visually. So I mean, there's that. But you're asking mainly, I take it, about the sense of line. Where would you end a line or break a line, and why would you do that? So for a long time, the principle of lineation was metered feet, and and grammatical units. They usually coincided in traditional verse. So your line's going to end on a comma, a pause, and that's going to be the end of a phrase. So that went on for centuries. So the kind of a sense of neatness and recursion, and the challenge and satisfaction of filling in those patterns with interesting variations. So that there's real difficulty in doing that, and real gratification for the writer and the reader. Who could not like those poems where it say, there it is, just dropped in there just so nicely. So that was the principle for centuries, and not an awful lot changed actually until into the 20th century, or just before the 20th century. You get people like Gerard Manley Hopkins, for example, who does wild things that I can't figure out what he did actually. I read those essays. He talks about the sprung rhythm, and I don't know what they are. Some people understand it, but I don't. But it's really wild. But you're well into the 20th century before very many people really abandon the traditional metered and grammatically measured line. So you get a kind of opening off that. But the kind of stuff I'm talking about is even more of a departure. You see, what if you use the end of the line as a suspension, which has always been there, but if you really emphasize this and develop it, you can create all kinds of interesting effects. Mostly it's a principle of suspension. Okay, we're here. Now what? One of the effects to use this prosody is to create a sense of false completion. Saying, it's over there. You better watch out for the red wheelbarrow. I mean, turn around a Carlos Williams poem. But it seems that the anxiety is the color red. You better watch out for the red. And then the next time moves into the wheels. You're taken aback. So part of this is a principle of surprise and perhaps even betrayal. I think what angers some people is that they feel betrayed. Wait a minute, you tricked me. This is what I thought, and now this is what I got. So there is that sense of surprise and closures or apparent closures and reopenings that run off that holding. But there's also a very different effect of hesitation that could suggest anxiety, of uncertainty, of wonder, of surprise, of not knowing what next, what could I say next, what is happening next. And you can get some very interesting rhythms. It could suggest love, could suggest awe. So you often get off those small lines and those suspensions, you can get a lot of hesitation. What I do perversely is often combine the effects, and it can kind of make a kind of a bit of an annoyance or trial, I suppose, for some people. But those are the two major principles.
One thing I'll see you do a lot is break an actual word in half, where the first half of it works as its own word. So you'll have something like, a really simple thing that I'll see you do is, I did int, right?
Yeah.
Where, it kind of reads, as you say, it seems as it to be a complete thing, or even, a word like, and lo, like that kind of completion. You think you've read a complete word, but actually it's part of a different word. Now you get, at least at minimal, you get a double the meaning. Maximally, you get, a bunch of other possible ways to read these things.
Yeah.
And it really opens up the meaning a lot. I remember being struck by that when I was, like a young man in school, trying to kind of really like get a handle on the craft of some of this writing. I was really struck by the way that you were so willing to turn over to the reader different ways to read this poem. Whereas I was so used to coming at things from the point of view of you want to control precisely how the reader is getting information out of this thing. And not that you don't do that. I mean, you have, your ways in which you're leading and misleading. But I think there's just this interesting willingness that you had that struck me. This interesting willingness to kind of put the reader in the driver's seat in a certain respect.
Yeah, well, I think when you write, in some ways you are acting as a reader too. When you make choices, saying, "Will this work?" or "How might it work? What happens if I open that gap there?" You often it's off instinct or half conscious, especially if you've done it for many years. You process stuff often without even realizing you're doing it. But that's a good part of it. What is it? What might the reader's expectations be? So I often, I guess, in some ways, betray readers or play tricks on them. So quite a few of the pieces are just smart-assy things. I shouldn't say just. I think they're not just that, but they're smart-assy things. Say, look at this. And then you're here. No, you're here. My God, no, that's happened. And so I often read them, those ones, fast. I am sure they're not easy for people to follow that in a first hearing.
There's a real nimbleness to it, though, and I think it really inserts a personality, I think, into the work in a way that maybe I don't always see, in people's poetry. Like either sometimes they're trying very hard to put a personality into it, but they're failing because they're not willing to play around and be nimble and have that. And they're just trying to have too tight a rein on the voice, if that makes sense. I'm sure I'm guilty of it myself.
Well, you can write poetry of many kinds. As a reader, I like reading all kinds of stuff. And I like to think as a writer that I have quite a range, in fact, of writing. Tone, rhythm, voices. But you can write quite traditional poetry that can be, to this day, that are powerful and moving, and sometimes I think if people are if they're quiet, if you were devoted Christian, it's probably more likely, not necessarily the case, that you would write quieter poems that are a little more tonally subdued. I would guess, out of that sense of your belief or your personality, or who you are, what you most believe in. So maybe I'm just saying what you're saying, that your style comes so much out of where you stand.
You talk a bit about Cold Press Moon and how it compares to Bestiary and what it was. Were you actually working on both those books at the same time, or were they just being published at the same time? Like, is there a way in which you see them as complementary?
Or do you see them as... are in any number of ways. A lot of the working was coinciding. And I guess I'm trying to think back in this. I guess I was working in them kind of pretty much at the same time. Turnstone said to me, I can't remember how they got onto this one, but anyway, they said, "What if we do these two books as a set?" This was several years ago. I said, "Oh yeah, I like that idea." So they talked about various ways of doing them. So I was kind of working on them pretty much the same time. I'm trying to remember the chronology of their being processed through to readiness for publication. They both came in about the same time to the press for their production. Robert Buddy did the editing, and he sent them in together. They came to me, and I had looked at it and said, "Okay, here's what I think about this or that," and we sent them onto the press at the same time. So I think the composition was close to coinciding. They were almost parallel in time. I'm a little vague about this, but that's my memory as I sit here.
And can you talk a bit about Cold Press Moon and what that book's about, or how that sort of compares to what the Bestiary is about?
Well, this is tonally, it's very different. This is a rewriting of some of the fairy tales that most of us heard as kids and read to our kids to this day. I expect and hope. So you get some of the standard figures. You get Snow White, and you get Rapunzel, and you get the crazy little guy with a woman spinning the straw. Rapunzel, thank you.
Rumpelstiltskin.
Rumpelstiltskin, yeah. A series of these things. You get Hansel and Gretel. Not very many that I deal with. And I move them again into other stretches. I pick up some Dracula. I pick up Frankenstein. But what I did with them, they're such wonderful things to work with. They're there in a kind of powerful way in everybody's psyche. And these things are they're much more, stories is much more violent and unnerving, I think, these fairy tale pieces. And where the creaturely poems tended to be comical and tender and kind of affirming. These are kind of troubling, I think, in many ways. Maybe readers won't find that, but I suspect that some of them will, at least, as they deal with roles that are precarious or destructive or ensnaring. And I try to turn many of them into a kind of contemporary time in a partial way. When I tell retell the story of Hansel and Gretel. Hansel and Gretel largely move through that kind of world as we know it, a force and this a witch, but that world turns into not a surreal world. I don't particularly interest in that, but almost a sci-fi world in some ways. But the father himself, even as he is aware of and responsive to a kind of medieval world of forests and farms, turns out is also a kind of very contemporary figure living in a house in a city, beside which cars flare by with their taillights. And he's there waiting on the porch with a light for his kids. So I kind of move these things around a fair bit. The characters, that same character, the father, addresses readers and appeals to them about how he might be perceived. Will people think that he's done ill by his children? And so I get a kind of variation on these stories that deal with also some contemporary concerns and worries and threats.
You seem to me to come often back to fables or fairy tales or pop culture kind of myths in this sort of way, even to some degree. And I'm just curious to know, like, what is it that you find most interesting about that sort of ground? Because you have returned, as you say, you mentioned you've done a book all about Dracula. You've done books that kind of, again, other books that focus on the kind of fairy tales and so on. I'm just curious to know what your attraction is to those sorts of, to reinventing those kinds of tales.
Yeah, well, the realm is part or comes from or brings us to maybe a realm that's a little irreal, forbidden. What happens out there in the forest, what happens in that shack, what's happening in the castle, wherever there might be. I mean, I've not done and not particularly interested in doing kind of detective stories or things like that. But it's there's a realm of danger and risk, and also in daring. Bloody Jack is this outlaw figure. Dracula is an outlaw figure. They transgress in various ways. In fact, they're both bloody figures, aren't they? I mean, I didn't think it until somebody said to me, "You're kind of obsessed with blood, aren't you?" But I mean, Dracula is a kind of Robin, or sorry, not Dracula. Bloody Jack is a kind of Robin Hood figure in various ways, and I construe my Dracula in some ways as a radical. He in at least one poem talks about himself as a red. He's redistributing things. You close the banks. You've shut down the currency. Nothing's moving now, and I'm breaking up these banks. I'm breaking into your vaults. he's the Red of his time in some ways. So I'm kind of interested in those figures. And I suppose that some of these fairy tale figures are certainly there. But it's tough, with there's a kind of risk doing those fairy tale poems as I did them. I think one of the first responses of readers are going to be, what's happening in gender in here? Danger terrain these days. But I have a lot of sympathy for some of the male characters too, as the father in
Hansel and Gretel one? The father you were just talking about, or a different one?
Hansel and Gretel. But I have a fair bit of sympathy for the Rumpelstiltskin figure, who's yearning, looking for some love and tenderness. He's in love with this young woman. How could she not see this? And of course she's unavailable to him. So he's a horrific figure in many ways, but there's a kind of yearning and loneliness. That's one of my themes. Yearning and loneliness runs through just about all of the books in one form or another.
How about with The Muse Sings? Because I feel when I first saw this book, I thought to myself, I can't believe that Cooley hasn't already written this book. Like, it seems so sensible and obvious topic for you, like to actually just take the figure of the muse, the person that the goddess who inspires poetry, and to kind of hear as these poems as attempts to invoke the muse. What happens when that goes awry, and the muse itself as a sort of the spurning lover, spurning the advances of the poet. It's such a perfect, as you say, it's something that kind of just ties together so nicely and neatly a lot of your recurrent themes, and then just have this direct connection to poetry, in which you tend to kind of course, be focused on.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to know how you kind of started with that project, and kind of how that hits you, and how you developed with that.
The Muse Sings?
The Muse Sings, yeah.
I'm not sure exactly where it started. I know where the publishing part of it. Again, it's actually a very simple answer. The publisher at Bay Press, Matt Judry, had asked, could we meet for lunch? I said, well, sure. And he said, have you got a book? I'd like to do a book. I said, of course, he said, you better believe it. This is my standard advice to poets for a long time has been, don't be coy. If somebody wants to do your book, you say it's yours. You're delighted that somebody wants to publish it. So I said, okay, good. What could you do? And I said, well, I got a bunch of poems. I must have been thinking at this point, because I think I said I got a bunch of muse poems. Yeah, I think I did. To check with Matt, but I think that's right. And he said, well, let's see what you can do there. So I went busy and worked on this for the next year or two. And a few years later, eventually, here's the book. But I don't think it was a particular thing that took me there so much as a kind of, I guess, almost a logical outcome, as you're saying, here you are. But why didn't you do it years ago? I don't know why I didn't do it a long time ago.
Do you find yourself just noticing that you've been writing a bunch of poems on this topic or that topic? Or do you find yourself really seeking out topics in a more active way?
I didn't understand that.
Do you find yourself like just looking at the stuff you've been writing and realizing, oh, I've been doing a bunch of muse poems or what have you? Or do you find yourself actually sitting down and thinking, what's the place I could look to mine? Like, would you find I guess, which is kind of comes first for you most of the time?
I think it's probably the combination. I think more recently it's become the latter case of saying, what have I got? And where might this go? Or where might it go anywhere? Does it have any larger potential? I mean, I do that with individual poems too. Say, okay, could I do anything more with this poem? So it's I do that at a local level and more expanded level. But a lot of the first ones came out of more identification. I started a long time ago a long poem with the Esteban minor strike. and I still got lots of drafts and notes for it. I hope to get back to it. But that is when I started writing Bloody Jack. And I can't remember why that interrupted there, but Bloody Jack came from a radio broadcast in CBC that two friends of mine did. And I heard that and I talked about them. Okay, so that was there. And I was and still am madly excited about Michael Ondaatje's book, The Collected Works of Billy the Kid. And at that time, I was writing a series of Billy the Kid poems, playing off Michael Ondaatje's books. And I'm going to write this. And I got about 20 pages, and they just kind of petered out. And I said to Arneson, I don't know what to do. I get nowhere with this. He said, well, is there a local outlaw? I said, well, we just heard this story of Bloody Jack Kravchenko, and I'm over there. And then that takes over for the next couple of years. But I happened on that by accident. But the 1931 Esther Miner's poem, I had deliberately chosen and wanted to work on. So it was a combination of those things early on, saying these are topics. I mean, some kind of came to me out of strong personal experience. My dad dies, I write a poem about that. My mother dies, I write a long poem, a book about that. So there have been a few of those kinds as well. So part of it's been prompted by instinct, accident, occasion. Some of them are finding sites that I've always been fascinated in. I found a book about space exploration, the cosmonauts, looking for presents. It's Christmas, and I find this stunning book. And I buy it, take it home, and away I go, playing off and with that material. So a lot of things just come off other writers, other books. Saying, the longest project I've been going on forever, I'm called Love in the Dry Land, that plays very loosely off Sinclair Ross's novel, That's For Me in My House. And I've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of poetry on that terrain. So that's
the big project you were talking about that started in '89?
That's the biggest manuscript by far.
You published some of that, but so you're still doing poems in that direction then. What is it about that book that attracts you so?
Well, in many ways a great fit for me because I grew up in Saskatchewan, on a Saskatchewan farm. Now it's a generation later, but the world that Ross writes about of a dirty 30s Saskatchewan, I'm just not far from that. Myself, I'm 20 years. I'm a kid 20 years after this, but those stories are all there in the community, and the after effects are still there. But it was also a certain legacy. I mean, that world of poverty and of a kind of stoicism that story of the Tacker and Saskatchewan farmer, a lot of people laugh at, and what a bunch of dolts. They're not dolts. These are people who have learned to contain their hurts and disappointments, and they bear them with a kind of stoicism. They're filled with emotion, and that's what Ross gets that so well in his stories, more powerfully in some ways, for emotionally in short stories than in that novel. But he really has a sense of those people. And so I find that book really moving in ways that a lot of people apparently don't. Maybe it may be generational, perhaps.
I always found that an impressive book, but more so in some ways his short stories. He has a story, I forget the name of it. I think it's called the Heifer, but it has to do with this.
One's a Heifer.
Well, yeah, that one. That story still to this day, just stuns me.
Yeah,
and it's a disturbing and fascinating, story.
It's also brilliantly structured.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
He was a really interesting character. He had done a lot of odd experiments through the novel and dialogue, and he's more of an experimentalist in some ways than people give him credit for as well.
Sawbones Memorial is a good example of that. Hardly anybody knows it.
That's the one I'm thinking about. Yeah, I've got it.
Sorry?
I've got that book. That's what I'm talking about. Yeah.
No, he was a very important figure, but he was writing when there were almost no chances for a writer in the prairies, almost none. Right? No bookstores. There are no book clubs. There are no internet to interview him. Nobody's teaching Canadian literature. Nobody's reading Canadian literature. Nobody knows there's Canadian literature, right? They shouldn't. It's indecent to write. He's the son of a puritanical in a puritanical family. It's indecent to write. He's training as a classical musician. He's gay. He's in this tough little prairie town. Man.
It's just a fascinating figure. And so, again, Dennis's 3 new books are The Bestiary, Cold Pressed Moon, and The Muse Sings. And, by the time this airs, maybe he has 3 new books out in addition to that. But it's a massive body of work. It's well worth checking out. And thanks so much for talking to me, Dennis.
Well, thank you very much. Take care.